We're looking at 5 disorders of capitalism by Streeck. So we looked at stagnation, and then we looked at oligarchic redistribution. Number 3 was the plundering of public domain. Number 4, we are looking at corruption. Last time we had looked at Streeck's comment on Weber's views about capitalism. So that was a bit of a digression from our current perspective. So today we'll finish corruption bit. So Pace, Weber, fraud and corruption have forever been companions of capitalism. Apologies to Streeck, because the last time I berated him on the last paragraph a bit, but he sort of take back a bit of it. So Pace Weber, fraud and corruption have forever been companions of capitalism. And now, from our perspective, capitalism is another name for corruption, or capitalism is corruption. Because in order to commit your life and energy as an individual or as a society or as a state to the sole purpose of accumulation for the sake of accumulation for the sake of accumulation, that requires corruption of your soul. And that requires corruption of society as well, because in the process, historically, that happened, the corruption of souls that happened through a long process. People don't just commit themselves to abstract ideals like accumulation for the sake of accumulation in a day, or neither do societies. And even today, a lot of people are just, in a sense, compelled to be part of the system, because that's how they earn their living. There's no other way out. And this level of corruption, so when we're talking about corruption within capitalism, we are not talking about this corruption. I mean, when Streeck is talking about corruption, he's not talking about corruption in this sense. So we can look at corruption in any system on at least 2 levels. We can look at a system in abstraction from its particular manifestations, and we might say this system is a corrupt system because it's based on corrupt ideals or corrupt ideas. But then there's the corruption within the system. that belongs to those people who are already committed to system, already within the system. They do corruption in the sense that they, for example, prioritize individual system. I mean, individual benefits or their own individual benefits over their, to be more general, their individual interest over the interest of the system. So these are two levels of, so we are talking here about the second level mostly. But just to give you an example, for example, and this is just an example, you don't have to actually commit to what I'm saying. So in Soviet Union, for example, you can say that, Stalinist system, for example, was corrupt in that it involved a lot of destruction, a lot of killing of innocent people. But as long as this was done for the sake of the system, we'll call it corruption at the level of the system as such. Its ideals are corrupt. So in a sense, we are looking at that system from outside. Obviously, no system is going to, they might be logically possible, but it's highly unlikely that a system would call itself corrupt. It's always from outside that you call it corrupt. In this sense. In the second sense, a system can realize that it is corrupt. But on the second level, it is possible that there were, Stalin included. I'm not saying it's true or not, but you can talk about the functionaries and especially the leaders of that system using the system to benefit themselves, to promote or preserve or sustain their interests. So this is the system, this is the corruption within system, and this sort of corruption actually clashes with the ideal of a particular system. Now, with capitalism, as I said, it's a system of corruption in itself. I'm looking from outside. No capitalist would say it's a system of corruption as such. So that's the system level corruption. But within the system, when people take advantage of the system, individual capitalists, for example, and do things which are against the morality and legality of the system, and then try to avoid blame through different sorts of mechanisms. And within market capitalism, without the without the overseeing, or without the guardianship, or just can't recall a correct word, of a state or another impartial observer, when market claims that it works on its own, like it's a self-regulating system. That's one form of capitalism anyway. Then it's supposed that individual capitalists, as long as they are not contravening anything, any legal injunctions clearly, their pursuit of their own narrow self-interest will culminate in accumulation for the sake overall accumulation for the sake of accumulation. Whether this might be a so that's why in a system like that, which believes in automatic or which believes in self-regulation, is more of a possibility that people will exceed the limits or break the rules, and that's where the corruption starts from this second perspective. And this corruption becomes brazen as the time goes on, and the pressure of accumulation mounts on individual capitalists or individual firms or individual companies or individual sectors. Another source of historical source of corruption within capitalism is, and this is oversimplification, but just to give the idea, is that capitalism starts with, as I said, periphery of a society, let's say England, and then it captures that society, overcomes that society. And become a mainstream force. And in a sense, that is a home to capitalism now. So its level of corruption, in the second sense, is less present in its heartland historically. After it matures, obviously it started with present. And so, for example, England, the sort of corruption capitalist, the colonialists did in India, for example, was different from the sort of corruption they did within Britain. So in India they did plunder, and basis of that plunder, they built the society in England, at least reinvested some of the profits. So with capitalism, there is always a different relationship with its centers, so to speak, where capitalism finds itself at home because it has moral and cultural and political and social power. Its corruption is more humane, so to speak. And as it goes away from those centers into peripheral lands or other lands, or colonized land or subservient lands, its plunder become more savage. Like, for the sake of things, Europeans even today are doing in Africa, for example, part of Africa, anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. Yes, and obviously the outside has different levels as well. So the outside can be more friendly to capitalism. So the heartlands of capitalism's relationship with Japan is different from their relationship with Africa, for example, because Japan itself has become a heartland of capitalism, or their relationship to Middle East is different from Africa. So even though both relationships are savage, still in the Middle East they have friends and they have a lot of long-term interest accumulation wise. So although it's savage, it's less savage than, for example, or less brazen than, for example, in Africa. So that's another source of capitalism historical double Janus face. But as capitalism matures and as capitalism matures and the opportunities for profit and opportunities for accumulation become less and less numerous, then some of that savage plunder and corruption comes back to its homelands. The sort of things we are seeing, in relation to even mature capitalist societies towards their poor, towards especially America is a great example, towards the black population, towards the Hispanic population. You see some of the savagery which capitalists, as a rule, commit in distant lands, coming back to their homelands, and obviously people like Streeck are not happy about it. So I mean that's the context in which we should read some of his comments here. So Pace Weber, fraud and corruption have forever been companions of capitalism. But there are good reasons to believe that with the rise of the financial sector to economic dominance, they have become so pervasive that Weber's ethical vindication of capitalism now seems to apply to an altogether different world. And you should apply this to some of the schemas and distinctions I gave in just before. Finance is an industry where innovation is hard to distinguish from rule bending and rule breaking. That actually has become an art form. We should look at some of the examples at some other time, where the payoffs from semi-legal and illegal activities are particularly high. I mean, legal, so here we are meaning legal and illegal, even according to the capitalist law. So they're not even observing their own law. So where the gradient in expertise and pay between firm and regulatory authorities is extreme, where revolving doors between the two offer unending possibility of subtle and not so subtle corruption. So one of the signs of corruption is bureaucracy in even the so-called mature capitalist countries. Bureaucracy and the politicians, when they retire or when they take early retirement, then they get jobs in the very same firms they were supposed to be overseeing before. So that's a form of petty corruption, or the second type of corruption, which has permeated mature financial capital today. And the best examples are seen in America because it's the most advanced capitalist country. But in other capitalist countries you can find those examples as well. So where the gradient in expertise and pay between firms and regulatory authorities is extreme, where revolving doors between the two offer an unending possibilities for subtle and not so subtle corruption, including the highest level, the Blair and Sarkozy, almost all of them. Obama is no exception, are now working for hedge funds. I mean, Obama is not working for hedge funds, but what he's writing books. Their time as elected national leaders apparently considered by them and their new employers as a sort of apprenticeship for a much better paid position in the financial sector. And Blair is not just in financial sector; he has become a criminal par excellence at the service of the highest criminals, the capitalists. Where the largest firms are not just too big to fail, but where the largest firms are not just too big to fail, but also too big to jail. And the post 2008 financial crisis and the lack of any big arrests or prosecutions attest to this. So where the largest firms are not too big, not only just too big to fail, but also too big to jail, given their importance for national economic policy and tax revenue. And also because they are dominant on the state in various ways. And the agencies which are regulating them, purposely, they don't even have the fraction of resources to actually, prosecute them and successfully, regulate them. And where the borderline between private companies and the state is more blurred than anywhere else. Because, especially in America, the financial capital is the dominant form of capital. So that's why financial sector has basically captured the state. As indicated by the 2008 bailout or by the huge number of former and future employees of financial firms in the American government. After Enron and WorldCom, it was observed that fraud and corruption had reached all-time highs in the U.S. economy. But what came to light after 2008 beat everything. Rating agencies being paid by the producers of toxic securities to award them top grades, offshore shadow banking, money laundering, and assistance in large-scale tax evasion as a normal business of the biggest banks with the best addresses. So basically, there's no one looking for the long-term interest of even capitalism. The sale to I think we should stop here and then we'll do it properly next time, the rest of it, rather than rushing it. Thank you.